second Sunday of Lent and powering through Mark because, of course, we jump through the narrative. And I'm not going to waste a lot of time with the narrative because you people are going to break that open for us. But I do want to say welcome to Eddie, first time, originally from Powers to North, which is, I think, where I kind of first knew him. Nicki in Brisbane, David from the University of Otago Theology Program. Welcome to you. And a rather confrontational passage in Mark. David, I'm sure you have some background.
Yes, some fascinating things to be aware of. Chapter 8 is the pivot chapter in Mark's Gospel. So we're pivoting from the first half into the second half, and there's a big rising of drama that goes with that. In terms of the geographic context, up in Caesarea Philippi, we're at a point quite distant to Jerusalem. It's a largely Gentile city, about 40 kilometers north of Galilee. And the site had an existing settlement when it was given to Herod the Great by Augustus. And in response, Herod the Great very strategically built a temple to Augustus at that point. The city was then refounded by Herod's son, Philip the Tetrarch, who ruled over this part of his father's kingdom during Jesus' lifetime. And Philip, with equal astuteness, renamed it Caesarea in honor of Augustus and added the name Philippi just to make it clear that this was not the Caesarea on the coast. Now, why is this important? Well, I don't know if the temple to Augustus was still standing in Jesus' day, but the Caesarea setting is suggestive of stark opposing choices: loyalty to God or loyalty to political power, loyalty to Caesar, as it were. This is the key contrast in the passage. Joel Marcus, who's a New Testament scholar, I think sums it up really well when he says, the city was thus associated with imperial rule, messianic hopes, and violent death, all of which make it a fitting backdrop for our story. That's his words, but I quite agree with him. In terms of the text itself, the verses immediately preceding are, of course, Peter's dramatic declaration or confession that Jesus is the Messiah, and immediately followed by Jesus' command not to tell people. Now, this is a high point in the first 8 chapters of Mark's Gospel, and of course presents Peter, the church leader, in a very positive light. However, the passage 8:31 to 38 that we're going to talk about gives a complete contrast to this, and of course Peter emerges much less positively.
So much there. Thank you, David. Pivot, pivot, pivot. That's really important. Clearly, I'm fascinated that the poor old land that this is happening on is still carved up and handed around from nation to nation, willy-nilly. So there's all sorts of resonances here. But that's not where we want to go. Let's ask Nicki where you find this challenging.
Well, I'm going to go straight into it. The Christian life is difficult. And Jesus asking his followers to take up their cross would have been a scary concept. If we give it a bit of thought, it's quite a scary concept, but maybe it doesn't need to be. So therein lies some of the challenge. Poor old Peter, he's declared that Jesus is the Messiah, and then Jesus starts to let everyone know, oh, look, it may not end very well. So he gets a bit put out. So it's often tricky when we're dealing with Peter and his own challenges, but there's some hope in there too. I don't mean to jump to the end of our conversations tonight, but at its middle, that living the Christian life is going to be difficult. And it's difficult because the way of Jesus is difficult, and yet it can be filled and surrounded and uplifted with love and promise in all of that.
It's not a comfortable one, but you're allowing beacons of hope. Eddie, when you read this, where do you find it challenging?
It's a very challenging passage. I mean, I guess I'm primarily a spiritual director, so I tend to think of these things in like, what does it say for us in our personal spiritual journey? And the translation I've got David Bentley Hart's translation, which kind of blurred there. And it says that you have to deny yourself utterly. Like, it's not just kind of make some sacrifices. It says, like, deny yourself utterly. And I guess a question and a challenge in the modern world is, what does that look like practically? And like, there's kind of 2 ways you can look, like 2 mistakes I think you can make. The first is you can do the full St. Anthony, which is, I don't think it was this passage. I think it was a similar one in Matthew, but like in the 3rd century, he was late to church one day And as he walked in, he heard a passage like this being read out, took it as a personal kind of instruction, sold everything he owned and walked into the desert for 30 years. And, that's quite you'd hope that none of us are going to be doing that. But there's also a tendency to look at things like this and think, well, he speaks a lot in parables, and, there's not really a need to let go of too much. So I think for me, the challenge is there's clearly an instruction. There will certainly be a sacrifice of self-interest of some sort involved in saying yes to God. So that's the challenge.
Thank you. Yeah, and not just giving up chocolate. I mean, we're talking fairly serious. And Nicki has deserts she can walk into. Here in New Zealand, we're preserved from that. So maybe we are God's own country
I'm a
after
long
all.
way from the desert.
It is quite a long way from Brisbane to the desert. Yeah, yeah. David, what do you find challenging personally here?
I actually picked out a couple of things very similar to Nicki. The first one being the harshness of Jesus' response to Peter. Literally, the words of associating him with Satan is remarkably hard. And I think certainly in New Zealand, where in the last couple of years we've had conversations around religious leaders and spiritual abuse, you'd need to look at this very carefully in terms of a religious leader speaking to a follower in quite such harsh language. But the main one, I suppose, I see here is for some people in the churches, there's an over-eager enthusiasm for taking up the cross. I mean, Eddie, I think, has touched on this in terms of verse 34, but there are just two comments I want to make on that. Firstly, at least for the conventional notion of the cross, the upright and the crossbeam attached, which is usually how the cross is pictured, that would be enormously difficult to pick up if that's the idea here. Just in terms of the physical logistics, it's not an easy thing to pick up. Now, it's possible the Greek word should not be understood as the two beam cross, but the single beam, the cross beam, which is what those who were condemned to crucifixion had to carry to the place of crucifixion. So maybe that's what's in mind. It's not clear in the text. But in either case, just the physical logistics are not straightforward. But I'm also very aware of conversations which have happened, particularly in feminist theology, around the damaging consequences, especially in the advice which is often given quite worryingly to women in family violence situations, that this is a cross to bear. And I think people have this verse in mind, and I think they're probably well-intentioned, but it's often very misguided and misplaced advice. So it goes back to, I think, Eddie's comments that we need to think carefully, how is this to be interpreted and understood? What does it mean in our contemporary context?
So easily abused. So again, let's go back to you immediately, Eddie, because there's a whole kind of spiritual dimension that's being raised as well. So for you, for trying to find some good news here.
This is actually full of good news. And he says it in the following passages, right? He kind of talks about actually losing. I think my text says soul, but it's often like losing your life will save it. There's this paradox. And I was reading this passage and I was thinking back to kind of my pre-faith life in my 20s. And I won't get too personal with this, but if I look at sort of the life I was leading, I kind of see a series of examples of the 7 deadly sins, like pride, a lot of envy, a lot of greed, a lot of lust, and very just self-obsessed, basically. And my journey of faith has been about letting those things go, which is a certain kind of self-denial. But I found that when I did that, it was actually liberating. And then my life turned into an adventure, whereas before I can see now I was kind of a prisoner. And that's the good news. The good news is that you think that this will be a loss, but actually you have everything to gain.
That is, and I'm hearing very powerfully, surrendering self-obsession is a powerful motif in our century. Let's hear from you, David, again, and where you look at good news here.
The good news for me, I looked at 2 of my theological heroes in terms of people who've influenced me in my own journey. 2 Basque Jesuit theologians, Ignacio Ellacuría and John Sobrino, both of whom spent their working lives in El Salvador in Central America. And in terms of a willingness to give up his life, certainly Ignacio Ellacuría did that and was murdered at the university in November 1989. Sobrino is still living and now towards retirement. But 2 huge figures, I think, in terms of Catholic theology and liberation theology. And one of their key ideas is not to valorize the cross in the wrong way. In fact, they advocate instead taking up the cross. They talk about taking down the cross. And that's the challenge that they offer, certainly in El Salvador, but I think more widely in what they call a crucified world, a world where crucifixion is still a current reality. It's as important to be thinking about how to take down the cross rather than simplistically thinking, well, it's about taking up and valorizing the cross. So for me, there's good news in taking down the cross.
And that's very important because it's a counter to that sad history of ours of Constantine picking up the cross, allegedly, in this sign, I will conquer, which has been a curse on us in many ways for centuries. Nicki, for you, where do you unpack the good news?
The good news comes through processing what I think many of us grew up with, this sense of burden. And sometimes it was in the too hard basket to necessarily process it until perhaps putting gospel conversations together. So this notion of taking up a cross can be turned around a little as we think the words there, take up the cross and follow. And I think it's a beautiful thought that no matter what we make of that cross, that we are able to follow. We are not asked to make the path ourselves. We're not asked to be trailblazers, but we're already traveling, following with someone who's been there and will be with us along the way. I think too, when we take up our cross as active Christians in the world, whenever we show compassion in the face of anger and hurt, that could be a form of taking up our cross. And wherever we are reaching out to help those in need, that could be a kind of taking up our cross, following the path of love.
Okay, let's sit with that and just quickly apply it in our own world with a bit of a so what. Can we go back to you again, Nicki, and just toss it around?
I often look at reading the Gospels, reminding myself we kind of know the end of the Gospels. We know that final chapter that takes us further. But it is a Jesus who we know takes our brokenness, because Jesus knows the pain of being broken. He knows the pain of betrayal. So what does it mean for us to know that Christ has gone before us and now shares that weight and that pain, that we can feel liberated through that and know that come what may, our Christian journey is made lighter and brighter because we have been given the power from Jesus to embrace our own healing and to help heal others, and we do that through love.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And Eddie.
So, I mean, like, one thing I was reminded of when I read this passage was something my spiritual director said to me fairly early on in my journey, just before I started the spiritual exercises. And I think he was quoting someone else. And he said that the Christian spiritual journey is a journey from narcissism to community. And what he meant by that was that it's one where you let go of your self-absorption and you come into a bigger story. And that will be an inwardly painful experience. You know, like it's not fun doing that, but it's also liberating. I think it's important. David made a good point that doesn't mean you have to tolerate any behavior from anybody else. And in fact, you know, somebody who is abusing their spouse is probably not making that journey. And actually following God might be having the strength to go through the pain of leaving, for instance. The idea is that you let go of what's not everything you want to do, but you just follow. I think Nicki made that really good point. Picking up your cross and following is going on that journey, saying yes to it, even though it will be something of a trial. But my experience is that it's also an adventure.
Yeah, thank you, Eddie. David, for you, so what?
I suppose recognizing the contrast in this passage, the challenge of taking up the cross and how that can be unhelpful, the value of taking down the cross and how that can be liberating. For me, the practical application is to know, well, which of those is right in a particular situation. And of course, I don't have a simple answer to that, but it did take me to the serenity prayer and its insights into the wisdom to know the difference. God, grant me the serenity to accept the crosses I cannot change, the courage to change the crosses I can take down, and the wisdom to know the difference.
And here we are going on at least a symbolic journey through Lent. So Nicki, Eddie, David, thanks for breaking this one open and helping us along this Lenten journey.